Welcome to our module on ecclesiology. Well, that's a big word. Probably none of us have used, not today or in the last month, perhaps, maybe ever, and that's okay. Ecclesiology simply means the study of the church. So we are going to look at Ryrie's Basic Theology, section number 12, simply entitled Ecclesiology, the study of the church. Ryrie dedicates chapters 69 through 76 to this topic, and we will look at those during this module. I'm going to take the opportunity now to give you a summary of each of the chapters that are dedicated to this module. And I'm going to warn you, okay, this is my disclaimer. I'm giving you a summary of the chapter simply to whet your appetite, to give you a preview of coming attractions. It is not to replace your own independent reading of this textbook and additional resources that you might find helpful. Okay, you will not be able to just listen to my summary of the reading and be sufficiently prepared to do the assignments for this module. So this is my summary, and I'll encourage you to dig into the textbook itself with a pencil in hand, making connections between concepts and terms and contrasts between those to see how they fit together or how they don't fit together. All right, so chapter 69 is our first chapter in section 12, Soteriology, and it's simply titled, What is the Church? What is the church? What Ryrie wants to do in this section is to disabuse many of us of our idea that a church is that building that sits on the corner of 10th and Texas Street, or at 123 Main Street, that church that sits out in the country. Everybody knows of the First Baptist Church or the First Methodist Church that sits out on that acreage. Now, that is certainly the way we use language, but in theological terms, that building that we're all familiar with, when we say, hey, I'm going to church tomorrow, are you going to go with me? Will you go with me to church? We use that word church in a very colloquial way, but that is actually a misuse of the word church when we refer to a building itself. And I was in Boston on a tour of the Freedom Trail, and it was an amazing opportunity to be there and to walk through the early steps of the founding of America. But there were some number of historic churches along this path, and when I say that just now, explaining that, when I tell people that, I talk about the churches that are there, and I'm referring to these old buildings from the mid-1700s. And I'm using the word incorrectly in that sense. And Ryrie is going to help us to clarify what the word church means, this called out assembly. So Ryrie is going to define the church as the body of Christ. It's composed of believers. Now, Ryrie is going to argue for two forms of the church. He's going to argue for a universal concept of the church, which includes all believers from Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, from Pentecost until the present day. He is going to then argue for a local lived out experience of the church. That is a local church, which is composed of believers in a specific gathered area. So called out of believers that meet in a congregation at 123 Main Street, for example. That called out assembly of believers that gathers at the First Baptist Church of Arlington or the First Baptist Church of wherever. Okay? So in chapter 69, Ryrie is going to walk us through these distinctions. One, in correcting the way that we use the word church to refer to a specific building, and adjust our thinking that the church is that called out assembly of believers in the universal sense of all believers since Pentecost around the globe, to a local manifestation of the church, that a called out gathered assembly of people who meet at a specific location at a specific time. And in our day and age, in different places in the world, also in the United States, there are occasions where different called out assemblies meet at the same church, but at different times. As immigration waves happen in various cities in the U.S., you may have an English congregation that meets in the morning and a Spanish or Indian or Nepali church that meets in the afternoon. I've been to a location where there's an English church that meets in the morning, and a Indian or Indian as in subcontinent of India who meets in the afternoon. And this is not an uncommon thing in the U.S. now, particularly as ethnic churches, immigration ethnic churches, typically are stretched by resources, and to build a building would be quite expensive, so they arrange to meet in churches that are already established and meet on alternative hours to call their assembly together. All right, so chapter 69. Chapter 70 is the distinctives of the church. The distinctiveness of the church. Okay, what Ryrie is getting at here is the unique nature of the church in God's redeeming or redemptive plan. Okay, the unique nature and role of the church in God's redemptive plan. If you have done an Old Testament survey at all, you surely are aware that God called Abraham out in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis 12, follow me and I'll make to a land that I will show you, and I'll make a great nation out of you. We call this eventually, as we go along, the chosen people, the Jewish people of the Old Testament. And then as we move through the Old Testament and into the New Testament, suddenly we have the church. And so there is a controversy in modern Christian. It's not even modern controversy. It's a long-time controversy of how do the church and Israel work together? How do they compete with one another? Are they compatible? Are they competitors? Are they similar? Or are they different? And so what Ryrie's going to do in chapter 70 is something that's really, really important, and it has a theological foundation based on what we call dispensationalism, that God works in various ways in various dispensations. And so while he worked through a sacrificial system in the Old Testament, he works through a similar sacrificial system in the New Testament, but there is a major distinction. In the Old Testament, God received the offerings of animals, the blood of animals. In the New Testament, he receives the offering of his Son, the blood of his Son. And the book of Hebrews helps us to see some of those distinctions, that Jesus, as our great high priest, is better than the high priests that were in the Old Testament. That Jesus, as our Sabbath rest, Hebrews 4, is greater than the Sabbath rest of the seventh-day Sabbath outlined in the Old Testament. So Ryrie's going to use this chapter to develop in your mind these ideas of distinctions or dispensations, and the distinctiveness of, in this age, what we call the church age, the church, the distinctives of the church in this church age. So that'll be chapter 70. Chapter 71, Ryrie's going to talk about, the question is principles or a pattern. And by this he means, as for example, the book of Acts outlines for us that Paul and his teams did A, B, C, and they established churches in the pastoral epistles that tell the churches how to function. The question comes up, is Paul giving a principle to follow or a command to follow, to do it this way? Just in easy terms, it would be, for example, the use of instruments in a church. While in the New Testament, in a church service, there's no directive in Paul's epistles of how to use instruments or that instruments are used. So there are denominations that say, therefore, because it's not written, use these instruments, that it's not permitted, that it, in fact, in their denomination, it is forbidden. So that is the question. Is the fact that the first church of Corinth didn't use an instrument, is that a dictate to every other church in the world? From then until now, you can't use an instrument? Or where to meet? What kind of a building to have or not to have? What day of the week to meet on or not meet on? You may not be aware, in other countries, and also in here, in the U.S., but in Israel, the meeting on Sundays for locals was very, very difficult, because Sunday is the first day of the work week, as Monday is in the U.S. So if you want to have a church with Israeli, Hebrew-speaking Israeli believers in it, Saturday is the ideal day to do it. Not because it's a law to meet on the Sabbath, but because the Israeli laws forbid Jews to work on the Sabbath, except in certain exceptions. But in general, Israelis don't work on the Sabbath. That means everybody is off. It's actually much more convenient in Israel to meet on a Saturday morning than it is in America to meet on Sunday mornings, because as America has become more secularized, more and more employers are opening on Sunday. Restaurants and malls and sporting events, and it becomes now almost a 7-day work week. You may not work all 7 days, but businesses are functioning, and maybe you're called in to work on a Sunday. In Israel, that's very, very rare that Israeli Jews would be called in to work on Saturday. There are certain exceptions in life-saving circumstances, so security and hospitals, those kinds of things, but otherwise you don't do your accounting work on Saturday. You don't work at the mall on Saturday, though, unfortunately, as Israel is becoming more and more secularized, some malls are pressing the laws, and so this is starting to happen where even malls are open. So if you work at the Levi store, you may be called in to work on the Sabbath or Saturday. So what Ryrie is going to walk through here is what we see in the New Testament are these dictates, that is, rules to follow, or are they principles to follow that give us a matter of flexibility? The principle is to worship or to gather regularly. So does that mean regularly as in any assembly has to meet daily? As it describes in the early part of Acts, that they met in their homes daily. They broke bread together daily. Does that mean that all churches everywhere and at all times need to meet daily, or can they meet weekly? Back in the early settling days of the U.S., there would be a traveling preacher that would come around by horseback and establish churches, but those churches would gather every other Sunday, every fourth Sunday, because he was a circuit riding preacher and would move about from different churches and come to preach at this church on first Sunday, this church on the second Sunday, this church on third Sunday, this church on the fourth Sunday. So the question is are we required to meet exactly, to have our naming exactly, our musical interests exactly, all in lockstep, or is there what Ryrie is going to argue for is a principled flexibility? There are certain things that are requirements. They are the musts. The qualifications of elders, for example, those are musts. What day of the week you meet on is more flexible. What hour you meet on that day is completely flexible. Whether you have a children's ministry or a Sunday school hour, or these are all in what Ryrie would call principled flexibility. All right, so chapter 72, the types of church government. The types of church government. There may be in this module, the students in this module may represent a variety of church denominations, and so you may be familiar with a different kind of church government or hierarchy, leadership than maybe your classmate would be. So basically, Ryrie is going to cover three distinct models of church leadership or church government: the Episcopal, the Presbyterian, and the Congregational. The Episcopal has a hierarchical, they have bishops, and so there's authority up above the local church. The Presbyterian is elder-led, it's representative, but elder-led, but also with some denominational leadership pressed down upon the local church. And then finally, Congregational, which is usually what Baptists are. They have local church autonomy. They may have a pastor, they may have a board of elders, but there is there's local autonomy. That is to say, that church itself makes its decisions, what days it meets, what color the carpet is, all of those kinds of things. It also will allow for the voice of the congregation. Typically, that's expressed through a congregational vote. Who becomes the pastor? Various other, maybe larger decisions. My own church is working through a building campaign, and so because we're congregational, that is, the church voted that we will proceed or not proceed. The leadership is presented. This is what we're looking to do with these kinds of changes. This is the cost. This is how we will repay it. And the church votes, yes, we will get on board with that, or no, we don't want to go into that kind of a program. So that's a congregational church leadership style. So Ryrie, he favors the congregational because he believes it has good biblical support, that it honors local church authority and accountability. That is to say, this church can decide what day they meet, what hour they meet, where their property will be, all of those kinds of things. And the accountability is local. You're making those decisions, and not someone outside of your congregation is dictating that the congregation will spend their money this way, the congregation will do this, that, or the other thing, but it's all contained within. All right. Ryrie stresses the importance of biblical leadership and a shared decision-making function. And the congregational system allows the congregation to have a voice in the things that take place. Now, so he warns very much against authoritarianism and excessive independence. Okay, those are the extreme things. We are so independent and in our local autonomy that we have nothing to do with any other churches. We don't think about other churches. We don't think about how our actions will affect others. Nothing like that. That's what he would call excessive independence and authoritarianism. And that could even be in a congregational church that pretends to have local autonomy or congregational rule, but the pastor is a dictator. So all of the systems have some area or potential flaws in them. And so I want you to spend a little bit of time looking at those three models that Ryrie will cover there. Chapter 73, Ryrie talks about something that's terribly, terribly critical here: qualified leadership for the local church. Qualified leadership for the local church. 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, Paul gives what are the requirements or the qualifications of a local church elder. This is another word we use for pastor, leaders. There are qualifications. Just because a guy says, I want to be a pastor, or God told me that I should be the pastor, does not mean he's qualified to be the pastor. So Ryrie is going to take this chapter and take us through the Bible's description of what are the qualifications for a church leader. He's also going to make the point that he believes that being a leader in a church, having a leadership role, is a calling from God. It's not just you wake up one day and say, I think I ought to be the leader, and not him. Okay? and it should be exercised, his calling should be exercised with humility and accountability. If God has called a man to be a pastor, doesn't make him a better Christian than anyone else. He can be a better Christian than other people if he dedicates his heart and his mind and his soul to becoming a better Christian, walking in Christ's likeness better than others. But that he has a title does not make him a better Christian. So every leader ought to operate with humility and accountability. Chapter 74. Chapter 74, these are what we call the ordinances of the church. These are specifically baptism and the Lord's Supper. Okay, the question is, in terms of the theological conversations around these, are we baptized? Do we participate in the Lord's Supper in symbolic ways, or do they impart some grace to us? Or I'm going to put it in very low language, do you get some points by being baptized? Do you get some points by taking the Lord's Supper in terms of points of scoring better with God or even gaining salvation through that? So Ryrie is going to take the position that while these are very, very important ordinance for the church, practices of the church, they will be primarily symbolic acts. They're not sacraments where we gain entrance into the church or gain entrance into the family of God, or we gain entrance into heaven because we have been baptized or we have taken the Lord's Supper. Certain denominations give certain or greater value to any of these acts. And some of you may come from denominations where there's greater importance or greater value, or you get greater points in terms of your relationship with God or your entrance into the church or into salvation or into heaven because of these. This will be an important chapter for you to tap the brakes and walk slowly through. Chapter 75, the worship of the church. The worship of the church. Worship simply means ascribing worth to God. Ascribing worth to God. Recognizing the value, the weightiness of God. Giving honor to God's heaviness. In Hebrew, the word honor is kavod.